Hello, I'm Miguel de Salas. I'm Curator of Botany at the Tasmanian Herbarium, which is a part of the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, and I'm here in the Bond store, which is one of my favourite galleries in the museum. Now the Bond store itself is a really interesting building because it's one of the earliest buildings we've still got left standing in Hobart, and it was the place where items that were coming in under bond, so things like liquor and so on, were stored before they were distributed to the new colonists. And so we've got exhibitions in this building largely to do with the early colony period, so early European colony in the Hobart area. And one of the areas that we've got, which I really enjoy, is the early botanical and zoological explorers of Tasmania in 19th century. And so one of the ones that we've got objects to do with here is this replica book of Robert Brown's herbarium. Now, Robert Brown is someone that most people in Tasmania wouldn't normally have heard about unless you happen to be a botanist like me. But he was one of the very first wave of professional botanists that ever came in the world. So up until the late 18th century, so late 1700s, the only people who were naturalists, who worked as zoologists or botanists, were people of means, people who didn't have to have a job for a living. They had money they had inherited, and they dabbled in the sciences. And that all changed in sort of after about 1750, and by 1802, when Robert Brown came here, there were people whose job it was to be a professional botanist, and he was one of the very first crop of those. Now, he arrived into Tasmania in the Voyage of the Investigator with Matthew Flinders, and he spent a couple of months doing exploration around the Bass Strait Islands, and he went to, I think he went to King Island, and he went to the Kent group, which is a bit closer to Victoria than us, but it's part of Tasmania. He went around the colonies that were established back then, and he came back down to Tasmania on the very first fleet and arrived to the early Risdon colony. Now, Robert Brown's a really interesting guy because not only was he one of the very first professional botanists in the world and coming out here to collect plants, but he considered himself a scientist, and he was interested in everything. And he was one of the very first Europeans to climb to the top of Mount Wellington, and that's where he collected a lot of the plants that we see here in this replica herbarium. And these are the plants that he actually collected from the top of Mount Wellington, but collected in recent times. And one of the things he did is he had his manservant, of course he had a manservant back in those days, and he had his manservant in Battery Point collecting hourly readings of temperature while Robert Brown went to the very top of Mount Wellington, because on one of his visits he noticed it was a lot colder up there than it was in Hobart, and so he was taking hourly temperature readings for 24 hours, so right over the night up on Mount Wellington, while his servant down here was doing the same, and comparing to see the temperature difference over a 24-hour period. Now, he collected a bunch of plants from around Tasmania, and when he went back to England, and keep in mind, the ships that were coming over in were absolutely minuscule. I don't know if you've seen any of these replica ships, but they were really tiny. They often crammed over 100 people in there, and they had all the food and water and things that they needed, and goats and pigs and all sorts of things. And they made a point to save space for plants and animals that they collected, for botanical collections to carry back to England. So he went back there and he wrote up what was essentially one of the very first descriptions of the flora, that is all the plants of Australia. And one of the big components of that was the flora of Tasmania, because he spent quite a bit of time down here in his 2 visits. So a really fascinating figure from the early 19th century.